Grab your magnifying glass because today we are playing detective. We're looking at a half-legible, handwritten note sitting on a desk, which happens to be the only real evidence of a massive, multi-billion-dollar global decision. It's literally the receipt for the very first time in almost 3 decades that the United States stepped directly into the currency markets. But here's the catch. They didn't do it for themselves. They did it to prop up an entirely different country's money.
So right off the bat, you've got to ask yourself, why on earth would the U.S. spend its own money defending someone else's currency, especially when the country on the receiving end just so happens to be the single largest foreign owner of American government debt on the planet? Well, we're going to break down the clues on the whiteboard today to figure out who actually needs who more. It's a really fascinating look at how global finance operates behind closed doors, and I promise you, the answer is absolutely not what you'd expect. Let's dive in.
Section 1. The official story. Before we uncover what actually happened, we need to look at the glaring contradiction we were handed by the officials. There is a huge contrast here, and it's enough to make any good detective raise a skeptical eyebrow. On the left, the U.S. narrative claims it's all about friendship. Just long-standing allies helping each other out during a rough patch. But look at the right side. The receiving country's official statement explicitly cites excessive volatility. If you translate that out of polite PR speak, it means their currency was absolutely crashing to multi-decade lows. It was hurting so badly that outside help had to be called in immediately.
Section 2. Where the money comes from. Now, to pull a massive intervention like this off, the U.S. completely bypassed Congress.
Picture a standalone piggy bank sitting right next to an empty chair labeled Congress. There's a standing account that exists specifically for currency operations, and whoever is in charge of this fund only needs the president's sign-off to pop it open. Historically, this lack of oversight has led to some pretty wild, unreviewable expenses. We're talking paying for an $8,000 rug, or bankrolling undocumented multi-country trips. By law, the decisions made with this fund are practically unreviewable by anyone else in the government. It's basically a black box of cash.
But the plot thickens. The real clue isn't just that the money came from this unsupervised fund, it's what the U.S. actually sold to get that cash. They didn't dip into dollars. The U.S. sold a completely different economic bloc's currency to fund this operation, and they did it without warning them, breaking a 28-year-old convention. That is a massive deal in the world of international finance. You don't just break a nearly 3-decade protocol unless you are in a full-blown panic.
Section 3. Why this country matters. Picture Japan as a guy sweating profusely under a giant, crushing stack of IOU papers.
That's their fundamental problem. They owe more relative to the size of their own economy than almost any other major nation. So why was their currency hitting multi-decade lows? It's simple math. Capital has zero loyalty. It just flows wherever it earns the best return. So with a massive global interest rate gap, foreign rates sitting near 1% while U.S. rates hovered much higher around 3.5 to 3.75%, the money was just marching away. It was fleeing to chase better returns in America, causing the foreign currency to just slide further and further.
So you might be thinking, well, why don't they just raise their own interest rates to close that gap and stop the bleeding? Actually, they've built themselves into a massive trap. Their central bank owns roughly half of their entire domestic bond market. They had to buy all that debt to keep their rates near zero for years. If they raise rates now, the interest they owe to themselves on that mountain of debt would absolutely explode.
Section 4. The only lever left. Talk about being stuck on a seesaw.
They have to make an impossible choice, balance defending the currency on one side or affording the debt on the other. They literally cannot do both. So with rate hikes totally off the table, they went for the nuclear option. They desperately needed dollars to buy back their own sinking currency on the open market, and they needed a lot of them, $74 billion to be exact.
But how do you scrape together $74 billion in a hurry? Well, because their wealth is heavily parked in U.S. bonds, they had to dump their U.S. debt onto the open market. This triggered the largest one-month Treasury sell-off by any country, ever. They liquidated an unprecedented amount of U.S. holdings just to save themselves.
And here is where you see the fatal flaw in that plan. It triggered a terrifying feedback loop that literally eats its own tail. Look at this. Step 1. They sell U.S. bonds to get dollars. But flooding the market with bonds makes U.S. borrowing costs rise, which is step 2. When U.S. rates rise, that leads to step 3. The interest rate gap between the two countries gets even wider, which of course causes their currency to crash even more, forcing them right back to step 1.
Every single dollar they spent defending their currency actually made the root cause of the crisis worse.
Section 5. Why this became America's problem too. And man, did it become a problem. America's single biggest lender just proved to the whole world they were perfectly willing to dump U.S. debt to save their own skin.
With a giant for sale sign hanging over that stack of bonds, U.S. long-term borrowing costs were suddenly shooting toward nearly 2-decade highs. The U.S. realized they had to stop this open market bleeding fast, entered the repo facility. Think of it like a pawn shop for central banks. It's a quiet backstop that allows foreign nations to hand over their U.S. bonds in exchange for overnight cash, all without ever having to officially sell those bonds on the open market.
But hold on, let's put our detective hats back on for a second. Just days after the massive currency intervention, U.S. officials heavily promoted expanding this repo facility. But almost nobody was actually using it at the time. Why would you push to enlarge a tool that's sitting at zero usage? I mean, you don't build a bigger life raft unless you are absolutely sure the ship is about to go down. They expected a massive crisis, and they desperately needed an alternative ready so their biggest lender wouldn't completely wreck the U.S. bond market.
Section 6. Closing. Let's pull out that handwritten note from the cold open one last time and put all these pieces together.
The light bulb is finally clicking on. The officials? Oh, they called it friendship. But the records scream self-preservation. The U.S. dipped into its unreviewable slush fund and shattered decades of protocol just to defend the currency of its biggest debtor. Why? Because if they hadn't stepped in, that debtor was going to keep dumping U.S. bonds, and America's own borrowing costs would have gone through the roof. It wasn't charity, folks. It was a firewall.
And honestly, the craziest part of this whole shebang? None of it was a secret. The feedback loop, the unsupervised fund, the historic bond sell-off, it was all public information, hiding right in plain sight inside data releases and balance sheets. You just have to know how to connect the dots on the whiteboard. Which leaves us with one final, pretty provocative question. What other self-preserving secrets and massive global interventions are hiding in plain sight in the data right now, just waiting to be decoded? Keep your eyes open and stay curious. Thanks for joining me on today's Explainer.